My Reading Autobiography by Josh Stewart. I would define myself as a troubled, struggling reader. That is not to say I cannot read or find it hard to read, but that I lack the determination, if you will, to read. In fact, I enjoy reading when it is of my choosing. When time allows, I can be quite the binge reader. The hard part is when I am forced to read, in particular boring works that I can find little meaning in. I find my mind wandering when I read the words and drifting off, almost as if I am not reading at all. On top of this, I'm also a very slow reader. I like to take my time, and it may take me more than most to finish. For example, when Aragon came out, I couldn't put that book down and finish the book within a week, but when I try and read a scientific or historical text about insects and disease, my mind just shuts off and it takes me 4 or 5 times as long to read the same amount. I like to think that I get a better understanding when I take my time, but being able to focus and finish reading in an appropriate amount of time have been my biggest challenges in school, and it is by these shortcomings that I define myself as a reader. I am a reader of interest. Some of my very first memories are of grandma reading to me at a very young age. She was my preschool teacher and was the person who took care of me almost exclusively from the ages of 2 to 4. She taught me how to read and write. I developed a love of literary works through her mentoring and teachings, and no one has had a bigger impact on me than she. Because of her, I never disliked reading. It has and always will be something I enjoy doing. One of my favorite books to this day is Puff the Magic Dragon. I was always so fascinated by it as a child and find more meaning in it as an adult. It was the one my grandma used to read to me before bedtime and has been the book I have chosen to read to my younger siblings. From the ages of 5 to 14, my father had the most impact on my reading life. During this time, my grandma only visited a few times a year, and I attribute this to my grandfather dying. It was a hard time for her, and she needed space. My father would read to my brother and I every night. One particular series that I remember was Del Toro Quest. It was my brother's favorite. I don't think I remember the series fondly because it was well written or extraordinary, but because it brought the three of us closer together. In middle school, each student was assigned an AR goal. As part of your English grade each year, you had to meet your AR goal each quarter by reading books and then answering questions about those books. Each book had an assigned point value to it. I scored a perfect 40 on my AR test, which meant that each quarter I had to read a significant amount of books and score up to 40 points each quarter to receive full credit. My dad suggested that I started reading the Redwall series when I told him I was stressing out because I didn't know what I was going to read or how to get that many AR points. It turned out to be one of my favorite series books, along with the series of unfortunate events. From these books, I developed an adoration for altruism. I remember one particular incident in the book The Bellmaker when one of my favorite characters, Finbar Galedeep, a sea otter, was killed during a brutal fight for a noble cause and essentially gave his life for his friends. Fantasy books have been my genre of choice ever since. It is fair to say that my middle school English teachers also had a great influence on my reading. I was forced to read The Diary of Anne Frank, The Black Pearl, Maniac McGee, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. All of these books I would have never read on my own. Shakespeare became one of my all-time favorites, surprisingly. As I grew older, my grandma again began guiding my reading and suggested books to me that I would not have normally read. When I was in ninth grade, she gave me a copy of A Wrinkle in Time and suggested I read it. After that, she always had a new book for me to read. Whenever she offered me a book, it would always have her notes in it, thoughts she had written down while reading the book. These were precious to me because I was not only reading a book and gaining someone else's perspective, but I was sharing thoughts with someone whom I cared about deeply. These experiences made reading a cherished and very personal activity for me. It was no longer about escaping normal life, but about sharing a foreign world with the people in my own in order to connect. I would say that the majority of books I have read were for pleasure. When my dad first introduced me to the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, I fell in love with it. However, when I began reading, I noticed that I did not know some of the words, which was unusual for me. I began keeping a list of words I didn't know and the page numbers they were on if I couldn't make sense of the sentence. I would then look up the definition and go back and reread those parts of the book the next time I read. During this time, I was also reading 1984, Hamlet, and Slaughterhouse-Five. I felt that they all had their own personal overtones and themes, but I was unsure as to whether my evaluations were correct. The internet gave me instant results. For example, I felt that Slaughterhouse-Five was a very anti-war book, and when I investigated further, I found that the author was a World War II veteran and that the book had been banned because of its anti-war sentiment, especially concerning the bombings of Dresden. Essentially, I can get instant feedback on ideas I have about the books I read or definitions to certain words because of the internet. I really like the idea of allowing students choice. I think that disinterest and apathy is a huge problem in schools today. If students can choose something they want to do, learning becomes automatic and not something mechanical we have to force into them. My biggest concern is that when I go into teaching, all of my students will be at different levels. I struggle with differentiation, especially when there are huge disparities in student knowledge, which is something I observed when I student taught. I also have a hard time integrating literacy into everyday math topics. I'm a big proponent of DEAR, drop everything and read, but other than word problems, I don't know how I would use reading or literacy to support my teaching in math.